let's go to the big issue, and that is anarchism. Um, you call yourself an anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist, to be precise. My question, or actually, I would like to pose more questions on this topic. But the first question is very simple, but I guess the answer should be very complex. How would an anarchist society would look like? How would anarchist society would look like? Sorry, and second question: how to communicate anarchist ideas? Because my experience is, and I'm not anarchist myself, but kind of sympathizer. My experience is that people, when you say the word anarchy, people imagine a lack of order. People imagine lack of security, something like the Hobbesian state of nature, the war of all against all, and so on. And I think that the general idea of anarchism in the general public is very much influenced by this misconception. So how to communicate anarchist ideas?
Well, with the first thing to do is to overcome the misconceptions, to explain what you mean by anarchism. Now, it's a pretty broad concept. Like, in general, the concepts of political discourse are very far from precise. I mean, to try to explain what liberal means or capitalism means, or any term you pick, they're used in highly varied and complex and often contradictory ways, and anarchism is no exception. But I think if you try to find a sort of core themes running through anarchist thought and action, there are some. Basically, it seems to me one should think of anarchism as not a specific set of doctrines, but just a kind of a tendency in human thought and action, which tries to detect and discover structures of authority, domination, and hierarchy, and there are plenty of them, and challenge them, ask them to demonstrate their legitimacy, recognizing that they are not self-justifying. They have a burden of justification. That's true all across the spectrum of human life, from patriarchal families to imperial systems and everything in between. Wherever you find a structure of domination, hierarchy, somebody giving orders, somebody taking them, whatever it may be, you have to ask, is that legitimate? You cannot assume that you shouldn't assume it is legitimate because it's been like that. That's not a justification. You have to ask, is it legitimate? When you do, you generally find that it can't be justified. There are cases, you can think of cases where you can make up a justification, but try it, it's pretty hard. Most of the time, the justification is the way power is distributed. That's not a justification. And anarchism is the effort to discover such systems when they can't justify themselves, to dismantle them and to move towards greater freedom, justice, opportunity, individual creativity, cooperative activity, and so on. It's just a tendency in history. And I don't think it's hard to communicate to people. I think they take it for granted if it's brought to their attention. And you see it. For example, take one of the major achievements of the last 50 years in many societies, the United States, many others, I'm sure here, has been women's expansion of women's rights. It's changed enormously. And how did it happen? Well, as soon as the structures of oppression were identified, they kind of disappeared. Which is not instantly, of course. There's resistance, still plenty of resistance. But they power, there's a nice, it's a general truth that power prefers darkness. If it's exposed to the light, it erodes. If people can see it, it erodes. And this happens all through history. Where does it lead? So what would the final goal be? I don't think anyone is smart enough to say that, to say what it would be. This is a constant, ongoing effort to try to expand the realm of justice, freedom, independence, breakdown of authority, and so on. And I don't see it should have any limits. You can think of all kind of concrete cases. So, for example, just think of the forms of authority and domination that exist in our societies. One of the dominant ones is wage labor. If you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution in England and the United States and other countries, people who were being driven into the industrial system bitterly condemned it. In the United States in the mid-19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was beginning, working people described wage labor as equivalent to slavery. The only difference was that wage labor is supposed to be temporary, whereas slavery is permanent. Actually, that was such a widespread idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln accepted it. That's when Northern workers went to war in the Civil War. That was one of their slogans. Want to eliminate chattel slavery, literal slavery, and what they called wage slavery. No influence of Marx or European radicalism. This just came straight out of popular understanding, the popular understanding of free, independent people who felt their rights are being taken away by being forced into a system where they have to sell themselves to survive. I mean, they understood, they had their own, this is the period of the freest press in American history, maybe any history. There's working class press, what were called factory girls, young women taken from the farms and forced into the textile mills, had their own journals. It's a very rich literature. And one of the themes was that if you sell what you produce for a price, like you're an independent crafts person, you make something and you sell it, you're selling what you produced. If you work for a wage, you're selling yourself. You're losing your freedom. You're the only thing that you're selling is yourself. You're losing your freedom, your dignity, your independence, your worth as a person. Well, over the century, century and a half, this has kind of been instilled into people's heads, and the intuitive understanding of the absolute injustice of this relationship has been kind of suppressed. But I think it's right below the surface. I don't think it takes much for people to recover the understanding that was second nature a century and a half ago. Maybe some work, but that's the kind of thing that organizers and activists ought to be doing. And that's a kind of oppression and domination I think should be eliminated. And we know how to do it. It should be eliminated by enterprises that are managed and run by their participants. Not a particularly obscure or even utopian concept that happens in many cases. For example, there's in Spain, Basque Country, it's a huge conglomerate, Mondragon, which is more or less run on these principles, not quite, but something like it. It's owned by the participants. They select their own managers. They don't manage it themselves, and they're under recallable and so on and so forth. That's a step towards overcoming the deep oppression of the wage labor system. In the United States, in the old industrial regions, so-called Rust Belt, where the factories have been abandoned and so on. There's a spontaneous spread of worker-owned and worker-managed enterprises, not huge ones, but pretty substantial ones. In fact, they're now one of the more progressive unions, the United Steelworkers, is right now involved in discussions with Mondragon in the Basque Country to try to integrate their activities. These things come very naturally to people. It seems perfectly obvious thing to do, and I don't think there's difficulty in communicating it once the point, once people are freed from the oppression that comes from just reflexively adopting the customs and conventions in which you survive. Actually, it's rather similar to the women's movement in this respect. So, for example, if you'd asked my grandmother whether she was oppressed, she wouldn't have understood what you're talking about. That's like asking, does she breathe? If you asked my mother whether she was oppressed, she knew it and she resented it, but she thought there's nothing you can do about it. My daughters, it's totally different. They won't even bother answering it. Those are changes. Those are changes that have taken place just through exposing power to the sunlight and seeing it evaporate. And I think this can happen in many domains. So what would an anarchist society look like? Well, the final result, I don't expect the final result. Human life is too complicated, but you can see steps towards more freedom, more elimination of illegitimate structures of authority, and where it goes is for people to